July 16, 1945. Trinity site, New Mexico. In the pre-dawn darkness of the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man, a desert basin so desolate that Spanish conquistadors had named it for despair itself, Klaus Fuchs stood among a small group of scientists 5 miles from ground zero, his eyes fixed on the skeletal tower rising against the star-lit horizon. The air carried the sharp scent of creosote bush and the metallic taste of anticipation. Around him, men in sunglasses and welders' helmets murmured final calculations and checked their instruments, their voices tight with the peculiar tension of those about to witness something that had existed, until this moment, only in theoretical physics and nightmare speculation. Fuchs adjusted his own dark glasses with hands that betrayed no tremor, though his mind was racing through a different set of calculations entirely. Not the physics of plutonium compression and neutron cascades that his colleagues were contemplating, but the practical problem of how to describe what he was about to see in a coded message to his Soviet handler in New York. He was a man living 2 lives simultaneously, a respected physicist integral to the Manhattan Project, trusted with America's most devastating secret, and a committed communist spy who had been systematically betraying that trust for nearly 2 years. In 45 seconds, when the gadget atop that tower detonated with the force of 20,000 tons of TNT, Fuchs would witness the birth of the atomic age. And within weeks, detailed technical specifications of that birth would be sitting on a desk in Moscow, delivered by a man who believed he was serving not treachery, but a higher ideal of scientific internationalism and socialist solidarity. What Soviet spies said when they witnessed America's atomic bomb tests was complicated by the fact that many of them were not spies in any conventional sense. They were believers, idealists, scientists who had convinced themselves that sharing atomic secrets was not betrayal but moral necessity, that American nuclear monopoly posed a greater danger to world peace than Soviet possession of the bomb. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this position would shape not just their testimony but the entire trajectory of Cold War nuclear politics. The story of Soviet espionage penetrating the Manhattan Project is among the most consequential intelligence operations in human history, a campaign that accelerated Soviet atomic capability by an estimated 5 to 7 years, transformed a temporary American nuclear monopoly into a balance of terror, and set the stage for decades of existential anxiety that defined the second half of the 20th century. The spies were not shadowy professionals dispatched from Moscow Center, but insiders, physicists, engineers, technicians who had access because they possessed the expertise necessary to build the bomb in the first place. Klaus Fuchs was a German-born theoretical physicist who had fled Nazi persecution, found refuge in Britain, and been recruited into the British atomic program before being sent to Los Alamos as part of the Anglo-American collaboration. David Greenglass was an army machinist assigned to Los Alamos who handled conventional explosive components. Theodore Hall was a precocious Harvard physics graduate, barely 19 years old when he arrived at Los Alamos and made the independent decision to share atomic secrets with the Soviets. And there were others. Their exact number remains disputed even now as classified files slowly trickle into public archives, forming a network that Soviet intelligence officers could scarcely believe existed. The Americans, so technically brilliant and security-conscious in some respects, had been astonishingly naive in others, vetting scientists for technical competence, but failing to imagine that ideological commitment to communism might outweigh national loyalty. The Soviet Union, by contrast, understood ideological motivation implicitly. Their entire system was built on it, and they exploited that understanding with devastating effectiveness. The Soviet spies had expected, if they thought about it consciously at all, that their work would be difficult, dangerous, and morally ambiguous. What they did not expect was the sheer scale of American industrial and scientific mobilization that surrounded them. The Manhattan Project was not a single laboratory, but a vast archipelago of facilities stretching across the United States. Uranium enrichment plants at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, employing 75,000 workers. Plutonium production reactors at Hanford, Washington, occupying an area larger than Rhode Island. The central laboratory at Los Alamos, carved from a remote mesa in northern New Mexico, where the theoretical and experimental work of bomb design proceeded in wooden buildings hastily constructed among ponderosa pines. The project consumed more electricity than entire cities, diverted strategic materials from other war efforts, and employed, directly or indirectly, more than 500,000 people, yet remained so secret that Vice President Harry Truman did not learn of its existence until he became president following Roosevelt's death. For scientists like Fuchs, who had witnessed the penurious conditions of European physics departments where researchers scrounged for equipment and competed for meager funding, the abundance of resources at Los Alamos was almost incomprehensible. When a piece of apparatus was needed, it materialized. When calculations required more computing power, in an era before electronic computers, computing meant rooms full of women operating mechanical calculators. More human computers were hired. When experiments demanded rare materials, those materials arrived. The contrast with Soviet conditions, which Fuchs understood from his ideological readings and contacts, could not have been starker. Soviet scientists worked in crowded institutes with antiquated equipment, making do with substitutes and improvisations, because their country had been devastated by German invasion. 27 million dead, entire industrial regions reduced to scorched earth. On that July morning in 1945, when the Trinity device detonated at 5:29 a.m. Mountain War Time, Fuchs and the other witnesses experienced what J. Robert Oppenheimer would famously describe by quoting the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The fireball expanded in absolute silence. Sound travels slowly compared to light, creating a sphere of plasma hotter than the surface of the sun, vaporizing the 100-foot tower instantly, turning the desert sand beneath it into a jade-green radioactive glass that would later be called Trinitite. The light was described by witnesses as brighter than a dozen suns, visible to a blind woman miles away who saw the flash through closed eyelids. Then the shockwave arrived, a physical wall of compressed air that knocked men off their feet, followed by the sound, a rolling, continuous thunder that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off distant mountains and returning in waves. A mushroom cloud boiled upward, climbing to 40,000 feet, an image that would become the defining visual metaphor of the atomic age. Fuchs watched it all with the detached precision of a trained physicist, noting the blast characteristics, estimating the yield, filing away observations that he would later transcribe into technical reports that would reach Moscow before some American military commanders even learned the test had occurred. But he also felt something that his training had not prepared him to process, a kind of existential dread, an understanding that physics had crossed a threshold beyond which the rules of war, diplomacy, and perhaps human survival had fundamentally changed. Other witnesses wept, cheered, stood in stunned silence. Fuchs remained expressionless, a man for whom ideology and necessity had created a compartmentalization so complete that he could simultaneously comprehend the weapon's horror and justify sharing its secrets with a totalitarian regime. The technical information that flowed from Los Alamos to Moscow through Fuchs and other sources was extraordinarily detailed and valuable. Fuchs provided specifications on the plutonium implosion design, the method by which conventional explosives compressed a subcritical sphere of plutonium to supercritical density, initiating a chain reaction. He described the initiator, a delicate device at the bomb's core that provided the initial neutrons to start the reaction. He shared calculations on critical mass, neutron reflectors, tamper materials, and the hydrodynamics of compression. When he met his courier, Harry Gold, at carefully arranged locations in New York and Santa Fe, he handed over handwritten notes and typed reports that represented months of America's most classified research, condensed and organized for maximum utility to Soviet bomb designers. The information was so precise, so comprehensive, that when Soviet scientists led by Igor Kurchatov began their own atomic program, given absolute priority by Stalin, who understood nuclear weapons as the currency of post-war power, they could follow American designs with confidence, avoiding dead ends and false starts that American researchers had spent years overcoming. Soviet intelligence officers who received these reports could scarcely believe their quality. One GRU officer later recalled that early atomic espionage seemed too good to be true, that there were moments when Soviet intelligence chiefs suspected the information might be disinformation, part of an elaborate American deception. But repeated confirmations, cross-referenced reports from multiple independent sources, and the stunning technical consistency of the data eventually convinced them that they had achieved the greatest intelligence coup in history. The motivation driving these spies was not simple greed or coercion, the traditional currencies of espionage. It was ideological conviction filtered through a particular historical moment. Fuchs, Hall, and others who provided atomic secrets to the Soviet Union were shaped by the political context of the 1930s and early 1940s, when fascism seemed ascendant, Western democracies appeared weak and compromised, and Soviet communism presented itself as the only systematic opposition to Nazi totalitarianism. For left-wing intellectuals, especially scientists, the Spanish Civil War had been a defining trauma. Watching fascism triumph while Western powers equivocated or actively supported Franco. Many had concluded that only the Soviet Union could be trusted to resist Hitler, a belief that seemed confirmed when the Red Army bore the brunt of the European war and ultimately broke the Wehrmacht's back at Stalingrad and Kursk. This ideological framework created a moral universe in which sharing atomic secrets with the Soviets was not treachery, but ethical obligation, preventing American imperialism, ensuring balance of power, protecting the socialist experiment from capitalist encirclement. The reasoning was sophisticated and genuinely held, even if catastrophically wrong in its assumptions about Soviet intentions and the nature of Stalin's regime. When Fuchs was finally arrested in 1950 and interrogated by British intelligence, he described his espionage not as betrayal but as controlled schizophrenia, a conscious division of loyalty based on what he perceived as higher principles than national allegiance. He admitted everything with an almost clinical detachment, explaining his actions as logical consequences of his political beliefs, showing little remorse because from his perspective, he had committed no crime against anything that mattered. The symbolic object that recurs through this story, representing both the abundance they encountered and the paradox they inhabited, was the security badge. Every person at Los Alamos wore an identification badge at all times, color-coded and numbered, controlling access to different areas of the facility based on clearance level. White badges for permanent residents, green for military personnel, blue for construction workers, and so on. A system of tiered access that was simultaneously rigorous and, as events proved, profoundly inadequate. The badges represented American faith in procedural security, in the belief that proper protocols and background checks could safeguard secrets while maintaining the open scientific collaboration necessary for the project's success. Fuchs wore his badge every day, passed through checkpoints where guards verified his authorization, worked in laboratories where classified documents were carefully logged and stored. The badge should have been a barrier, a symbol of exclusion that separated those trusted with atomic secrets from those outside. Instead, for Fuchs and others, it became a key, formal authorization to access exactly the information Moscow wanted, granted by a system that never imagined someone with impeccable anti-fascist credentials and brilliant scientific contributions might have divided loyalties. The badge was also a kind of camouflage, visual confirmation that its wearer belonged, that they were inside the circle of trust. Fuchs would later describe the strange sensation of wearing his Los Alamos badge while carrying classified documents to his espionage meetings. The juxtaposition of official authorization and secret betrayal collapsed into a single object pinned to his shirt. The transformation in how these spies understood their actions came slowly, often incompletely, sometimes not at all. For Fuchs, who lived long enough to witness both the Cuban Missile Crisis and the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was eventual acknowledgement that his certainty had been misplaced, that Stalin's regime had been far worse than he had allowed himself to believe, that the nuclear arms race he helped enable had brought the world to the edge of annihilation rather than preserving peace through balance. He spent 9 years in British prison after his 1950 conviction, then emigrated to East Germany, where he continued scientific work, lived quietly, and gave occasional carefully worded interviews in which something like regret flickered at the edges of his rationalized explanations. But he never fully recanted, never truly admitted that his espionage had been simply wrong, rather than tragically misjudged in its consequences. Theodore Hall, by contrast, was never prosecuted. American counterintelligence knew of his role, but lacked sufficient evidence for conviction, and he lived out his life as a biophysics professor, his atomic espionage a secret kept from all but a few, until Soviet archives were partially opened in the 1990s. When finally confronted by historians, Hall defended his younger self's decision, arguing that Soviet possession of atomic weapons had indeed prevented American nuclear dominance, and thus contributed to avoiding World War III. The argument was not wholly without merit. Some historians and strategists have suggested that mutual vulnerability created more stability than monopoly might have, but it required ignoring the crushing weight of Soviet crimes and the countless near misses that brought nuclear war terrifyingly close. What the Soviet intelligence apparatus did with the information it received was almost as remarkable as the espionage itself. The stolen data was analyzed, translated, and delivered to Kurchatov's team, which worked under conditions that mirrored and inverted Los Alamos. Where American scientists enjoyed comfortable housing, well-stocked commissaries, and family amenities despite the isolation, Soviet atomic scientists worked in facilities hastily constructed outside Moscow, with inadequate heat, chronic shortages, and the constant pressure of NKVD surveillance. Where Los Alamos operated with informal collegiality, Oppenheimer's leadership style emphasized open discussion and intellectual debate. The Soviet program combined scientific work with Stalinist terror, where failure could mean not just professional disgrace, but arrest and execution. Yet they succeeded with shocking speed. On August 29, 1949, just 4 years after Hiroshima, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan. American intelligence detected the test through radioactive traces in the atmosphere, and President Truman announced it publicly on September 23rd, shocking a nation that had assumed nuclear monopoly would last a decade or more. The first Soviet bomb, designated First Lightning but known in the West as Joe 1, was virtually identical to the American plutonium implosion device tested at Trinity and dropped on Nagasaki. Not because Soviet scientists lacked creativity, but because copying a proven design was faster and more certain than independent development, and Stalin demanded speed above all else. The revelation that Soviet atomic capability had come so quickly triggered waves of paranoia, recrimination, and fundamental transformation in American security culture. The spy hunts that followed, culminating in the arrests of Fuchs in Britain, the Rosenbergs in America, and a widening net of investigations, created a climate of suspicion that damaged scientific openness for decades. The Atomic Energy Commission implemented stringent new security protocols. Loyalty oaths became mandatory. The career-destroying accusation of being a communist sympathizer became a weapon in academic and government circles. The hunt for atomic spies was not unjustified. The espionage had been real and its consequences profound, but it metastasized into McCarthyism, destroying innocent lives and creating a culture of fear that was antithetical to the open inquiry on which science depends. The irony was bitter. American openness and collaborative spirit had enabled both the rapid success of the Manhattan Project and the vulnerability that allowed its secrets to be stolen. The reaction to that theft created a closed, paranoid environment that hindered subsequent scientific progress. The Soviet Union, by contrast, experienced no such crisis of confidence. Espionage was expected, security through fear and compartmentalization was standard operating procedure, and the acquisition of atomic weapons validated their system's capacity to compete with capitalism on the most critical technological frontier. The geopolitical consequences unfolded across subsequent decades with the inexorable logic of mutual fear. The American nuclear monopoly, which might have been a tool for coercive diplomacy in the early post-war years, lasted barely 4 years before becoming a duopoly, then an arms race. The hydrogen bomb followed, an even more powerful fusion weapon, again with espionage playing a role as Fuchs provided early theoretical work on fusion reactions before his arrest. The delivery systems multiplied. Strategic bombers, then intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched missiles, tactical nuclear weapons for battlefield use. The arsenals grew to insane numbers, tens of thousands of warheads on each side, far exceeding any rational military requirement, accumulating under their own momentum driven by military-industrial interests, worst-case planning, and the fundamental instability of mutual assured destruction. The nuclear arms race consumed resources that might have built cities, cured diseases, explored space for peaceful purposes. It created constant existential anxiety, the ever-present knowledge that civilization could end in 30 minutes if someone made the wrong decision or a system malfunctioned. And at the root of it all, accelerating its pace and ensuring that American nuclear monopoly could not be sustained, were the decisions made by scientists like Fuchs, who believed they were acting for humanity's benefit but instead enabled the very catastrophe they claimed to oppose. The meetings between Soviet spies and their handlers took place in circumstances so mundane they seemed almost absurd given the stakes involved. Harry Gold, the courier who served as intermediary for Fuchs and others, would meet his sources in ordinary public spaces, street corners in New York, a walk along the Santa Fe River, a bench in a city park. Fuchs would arrive carrying classified documents in an ordinary envelope or briefcase, looking like any professional heading to a meeting. They would exchange recognition signals, pre-arranged phrases about the weather or asking for directions, then walk together while Fuchs verbally summarized technical information and handed over written materials. Gold would memorize what he could, ask clarifying questions if he had been instructed to gather specific details, then separate and carry the documents to his Soviet contact, often Anatoly Yatskov, operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet consulate in New York. The entire transaction might take 15 minutes, conducted in public, hiding in the open because surveillance resources were limited and no one suspected a respected physicist of treason. The ordinariness of these encounters, no dead drops in hollowed-out trees, no invisible ink, no dramatic escapes, reflected both the spies' amateur status and the fact that American counterintelligence had not imagined the threat. Later, when the FBI began investigating atomic espionage seriously, they found that basic tradecraft was often lacking, that evidence had been left in plain sight because the spies had not really believed they would be caught, so convinced were they of the righteousness of their cause. By the time Fuchs was arrested in January 1950, the damage was complete and irreversible. His confession to British intelligence officer William Scarden came after weeks of careful interrogation that finally broke through his compartmentalization. The transcript of his confession reads like a philosophical treatise on divided loyalty, Fuchs explaining his reasoning with the same precision he brought to physics, describing how he had maintained two separate mental frameworks, justifying his actions through elaborate moral calculus. But even in confession, he was calculating. He provided enough information to satisfy interrogators and demonstrate cooperation, while withholding details that might expose other sources still operational. The confession led to his conviction and imprisonment, and ultimately to the unraveling of other parts of the network. American authorities, informed by British intelligence, traced connections to Harry Gold, then to David Greenglass, then to Greenglass's sister Ethel Rosenberg and her husband Julius. The Rosenberg case became the most controversial espionage prosecution in American history. Julius was clearly guilty of recruiting and coordinating a spy ring. Ethel's involvement was marginal at most, yet both were executed in 1953, the only American civilians executed for espionage during the Cold War. The executions were meant as deterrence, a demonstration that atomic espionage would be punished with ultimate severity, but they also became martyrdom, propaganda victories for Soviet intelligence and the international left. What Soviet spies said when they witnessed America's atomic bomb tests, whether directly like Fuchs at Trinity or through the technical documentation they studied and transmitted, was filtered through ideological commitment that distorted perception even as they recorded facts with scientific precision. They saw the technical achievement and reported it accurately. They saw the industrial capacity that made such achievement possible and marveled at it, but they interpreted all of it through a framework that cast American power as threat rather than deterrent, that assumed Soviet acquisition of nuclear weapons would create peace through balance rather than multiply dangers through proliferation. They were brilliant and deluded, principled and catastrophically wrong, motivated by ideals they held more important than national loyalty, yet blind to the realities of the regime they served. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain their positions was extraordinary. To work alongside American colleagues who trusted them, to participate in the scientific enterprise dedicated to ending the war with Japan and deterring future aggression, while simultaneously undermining that very purpose by ensuring America's most dangerous enemy acquired the same capability. The epilogue of atomic espionage extends into the present. The weapons whose secrets were stolen in the 1940s evolved into arsenals that still exist, maintained at enormous cost, still targeted, still ready for launch on warning times measured in minutes. The deterrence they provide is real but unstable, a balance of terror that has prevented great power war but created new categories of existential risk: accidental launch, unauthorized use, nuclear terrorism, proliferation to unstable regimes. The world that Fuchs and other atomic spies helped create is one where 9 nations possess nuclear weapons, where the knowledge of how to build them has spread beyond control, where the genie can never be returned to the bottle. Whether their espionage accelerated or prevented catastrophe remains genuinely uncertain. Counterfactual history offers no definitive answers. Perhaps American nuclear monopoly in the late 1940s would have enabled coercive diplomacy that prevented Soviet expansion, avoided the Korean War, changed the trajectory of the Cold War. Or perhaps, as the spies believed, that monopoly would have led to preventive war, to nuclear strikes against a weakened Soviet Union before it could threaten American dominance, to millions dead and radiation poisoning the globe. We will never know what might have been, only what was, a balance of terror that held, barely, through decades of crises, miscalculations, and near misses. The lesson that emerged from the security badge, that recurring symbol of authorized access turned betrayal, was one that governments internalized too well. Trust became suspect, openness became vulnerability. The scientific culture that had enabled the Manhattan Project's success, brilliant minds collaborating across disciplines, sharing information freely within the classified enclave, became impossible to sustain once the reality of penetration was known. Compartmentalization increased. Need-to-know restrictions multiplied. The joy of collaborative discovery was poisoned by suspicion. And perhaps this was the deepest damage the atomic spies caused. Not just the specific secrets they stole, but the trust they destroyed, the open scientific community they made impossible. The badge that should have represented belonging became a reminder that no system of authorization can fully safeguard secrets when human beings bring their ideological commitments, their divided loyalties, their capacity for rationalized betrayal into spaces that depend on trust. What Soviet spies said when they witnessed America's atomic bomb tests was less significant than what they did with that knowledge. They transmitted it to a regime that would use it to threaten the very survival of the world, convinced they were acting for peace, blind to the contradiction at the heart of their cause. They were believers who became traitors, idealists who enabled proliferation, scientists who understood physics with brilliant clarity but human nature and political reality with catastrophic blindness. The mushroom cloud rising over Trinity that July morning in 1945 marked not just the birth of atomic weapons, but the beginning of an age when human knowledge had outpaced human wisdom, when technical capability exceeded moral framework, when the difference between salvation and annihilation rested on the judgment of fallible human beings operating under ideological certainty that would prove, again and again, to be dangerously incomplete. The atomic spies helped build the world we still inhabit, armed, afraid, deterred from ultimate war but never secure, never safe, carrying forward the consequences of decisions made in laboratories and desert proving grounds and secret meetings, where men convinced themselves they were serving humanity while betraying it, where idealism curdled into complicity, where the badge of belonging became the emblem of a trust that could never be fully restored.